Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Oh boy, it's already 2011. Time to look back and look forward, and time to bring in Stacy Herbert. Stacy.
Max Keiser, I thought you were going to mention that 2011, we already see silver spiking.
It didn't take long for silver to bust out of the gate. What else? What else?
Well, we have the 2010 asset performance numbers. They are in. Number 1 is palladium, number 2, cotton, but number 3 performer of last year, silver, up 83.5%.
Yeah, I remember the Palladium Club back in New York City in the 80s. Did some serious dancing.
Well, Max, gold was only up 29.5%. Just up that much.
Laggard.
But with the silver and gold up these much, of course, we've been talking about these as currencies, and it takes me to the next headline. Georgia GOPer pushes bill for taxes to be paid in gold and silver. This is from TalkingPointsMemo.com, and it's a relatively progressive left-wing website in the U.S., if you can call anybody there left-wing. And they're talking about Georgia State Representative Bobby Franklin, Republican, has sponsored legislation to force the state to conduct all monetary transactions with U.S. gold or silver coins.
Yes, well, the fact is that the U.S. has never been off the gold standard in one way or another. It's hard-coded in the Constitution. And now they're just slowly recognizing this eventuality that they must return to hard money to prevent the slide into the fiat money abyss.
Well, the most interesting thing about this article is the comments. This is an excellent idea. However, why stop at gold? I suggest that the proposed legislation be expanded to include polished stones, beads, blankets, and trinkets. Eureka! More ignorant. GOP politicians or the dupes who vote against their own interests. And then finally, GOP and their nutty, unhinged ways.
Well, yeah, it's amazing that the so-called left, so-called progressives in America have bought hook, line, and sinker this idea that a Federal Reserve note that has no collateral value whatsoever, that's exchangeable into nothing, is somehow of value in an economy like the U.S. At the same time, of course, they're talking about raising the debt ceiling in the U.S. to $14, $15, $16, $20 trillion. Why do they have to keep raising the debt level? Because they keep flooding the economy with these worthless, bogus fiat U.S. dollars.
Silver is up 83.5% last year. Gold is up 29.5%. The dollar is up 1%. I remember the dollar is allegedly a safe haven in these, tumultuous times. And here are these people holding on to the dollar for dear life and laughing at anybody who would dare buy silver or gold. That just shows you that you're nowhere near a bubble.
Good old Kentucky bourbon. That's a good currency to use in times of harshness. Yes, bourbon and bullets. Go back to the pioneering days in America.
Bourbon bullets and pork bellies. Pork bellies did a lot better than the US dollar as well. But speaking of nutty and unhinged, Max Keiser, Obama aide throws down gauntlet in debt showdown with GOP. Hitting debt ceiling would be first US default caused purely by insanity. So this is Austin Goolsbee, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, speaking to ABC's Jake Tapper. And he's talking about the debt ceiling, which now stands at $14.294 trillion, and the national debt is now only $423 billion away from it. Now, the Democrats want to raise it to $15.5 trillion. And to put that into context, look at this chart. This is the GDP of the USA in 2009. That's $14.119 trillion. They want to raise the debt ceiling to $15.5 trillion.
And I think the key phrase here is insanity.
Yeah.
To raise the debt ceiling is a tacit admission of default. In other words, the U.S. has bonds. They can't pay off the bonds to people like China. So instead, they're simply going to move the goalposts. They're going to lower the bar. They're going to raise the debt ceiling, which is a de facto default, which I think is a good way to look at it. And I think the world has got to realize that at some point, probably this year, in 2011, the U.S. will definitely lose its AAA rating on its U.S. government bonds and probably default.
Well, you mentioned the AAA rating, and that's in the headline. Today on TV, we saw the one huge reason the U.S. should lose its AAA rating. Now, this is Paperbug, Joe Wiesenthal from Business Insider, and he's pointing out that Lindsey Graham spoke on Meet the Press, and he was basically playing chicken with Austin Goolsbee on the president's Council of Economic Advisors. Barack Obama wants to raise the debt ceiling. Lindsey Graham, the senator, the Republican senator in the U.S. Senate, doesn't want to raise the debt ceiling unless we cut Social Security payments.
And they believe that they have the power to maintain that AAA rating simply by jawboning the market, simply by stating on television that these bonds are worth AAA, therefore they are AAA. They're not going to take into consideration at all that China's got something like $2.5 trillion of these bonds and might at one point this year decide to dump them as they move into precious metals aggressively to disconnect this relationship with the U.S., while we now know China is got that pipeline that they just opened going right with Russia. So they don't need the petrodollar anymore.
Well, going back to this article, it's Joe Wiesenthal. He's a paperbug. He's arguing that hasn't Moody's downgraded the U.S. when these two insane people, these two insane parties are just like playing chicken over the debt. But that takes us back to the precious metals because, of course, you don't have to rely on crazy, insane people and politics to decide whether or not the value of your currency is worth something.
Moody's is corrupt. We know that Moody's is corrupt. There's that Moody's is corrupt. All the rating agencies are corrupt. The fund managers are corrupt. Wall Street's corrupt. Barack Obama's corrupt. Goldman's corrupt. They're all corrupt. It's all part of a corrupt syndicate. I mean, to suggest that Moody's is somehow acting in the good faith is ludicrous.
But they also work hand in hand with the U.S. government and the oligarchs. So let's go on to the next headline along these same lines. WikiLeaks. U.S. diplomats acted as Boeing salespeople. Buried in the WikiLeaks documents, they're not really buried, they're just not exposed to the U.S. Audience because they don't need to know this kind of stuff. But apparently, WikiLeaks cables describe letters from presidents, state visits as bargaining chips, and a number of leaders making big purchases based at least in part on how much the companies will dress up private planes.
Yeah, they're like used car salesmen. They go around the world, Hillary Clinton being the top used car salesman of them all, used jet salesman, going around the world saying, hey, buddy, buy some jets and we'll get you some FaceTime with Barack Obama. Hey, buy some Boeing jets and we'll splash out on an embassy in your hometown and give you some kickback money. It's totally corrupt. This is the American empire. It's not an empire based on guns and tanks and invasions and grabbing property. It's an empire based on flooding the globe with these diplomatic salespeople, spreading the U.S. corporations and their tentacles into various corners of the U.S. world for that massive global income coming their way.
Yes, but we've also been covering this fact that the left wing hates the right wing and the Republicans versus the Democrats and the red states versus blue states, and everybody's going to be better in some way. But these documents reveal that on both sides of the equation, none of the politicians believe in capitalism. They don't believe in free markets. They only believe in rigged markets for their oligarchs. Going around the world, who's the competition to Boeing? They're not allowing it because they're going in, they're strong-arming these people. And the documents also suggest that demands for bribes, or at least payment to suspicious intermediaries who offer to serve as agents, still take place. Boeing says it is committed to avoiding any such corrupt practices.
No, they're totally corrupt, Boeing. But their competition, of course, is Airbus. And Airbus is a consortium of European countries. And, of course, the U.S. is constantly pointing the finger at Airbus and saying, Europe has an industrial policy, that they're subsidizing Airbus, and that that's unfair competition. Meanwhile, you've got the U.S. with the world reserve currency and 400 embassies and what do you call them there? Military bases. Yeah, with those things spread out all over the world, using that leverage to sell the Boeing plane. And by the way, if you look at the exports in the U.S. that they will look at and say, well, America does export stuff. It's not just donuts and guns. They always point to Boeing planes. Well, if you took away all of the salesmanship going on by the diplomats that are being underwritten by all these countries who are supporting the flying around of these diplomats to put them in these five-star hotels to get them in a position to sell all this junk to U.S. diplomatic counterparties, you'd end up with Boeing stock cut in half. and the entire export myth of America completely obliterated, as it should be, because the country can't export a frickin' paper bag, much less a jet, without being undermined and subsidized by the frickin' government.
But speaking of corruption, here's some headlines on this and this collapsing empire of America. Oops, bribing Nigeria for Cheney's freedom, not legal. Well, this is according to Nigeria's anti-corruption watchdog. They sent a letter to the Nigerian government saying that the $35 million that Halliburton has paid the government of Nigeria in order to make the case against Dick Cheney go away, he's implicated in this corruption scandal of paying huge kickbacks to the government. Well, apparently the Nigerian government responded to the anti-corruption watchdog by saying the US and the UK governments are practicing it. Where you cannot successfully sustain a charge in court and you want to recover, then instead of losing the case, losing the money, then you opt for plea bargaining.
Dick Cheney. Thanks, Dick.
This is the shining light on the hill of America. But I have a headline from this very first week of the new year as well, which proves that Nigeria is correct in making this argument.
I'm ready for it.
Steve Ratner, U.S. car czar, pays $10 million over bribery claims. So this is the banker who advised the U.S. government on auto industry bailout. He's settled allegations he paid kickbacks to win state pension fund investments. He settled with Andrew Cuomo. He's paying these fines and penalties, and he's banned from appearing in any capacity before any public pension fund in New York for 5 years. That's a big punishment.
Yeah. Well, the tragedy is simply if you got rid of all these kleptocratic boogeymen, you'd let the people in America compete on the global markets, and they could do a fine job competing, but they'll never have that chance because all the roads to competition are blocked by Obama's kleptocratic coterie.
Yeah, and why aren't these people sent to the private prisons? Like, let the prisons compete for these customers.
Yeah.
These are high-profile guys. They want to into your private prison, drive up competition.
Darn good point. Stacy Herbert, thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Matt.
All right, when I come back, I'll be going to Bangkok to speak with J.S. Kim, find out what's going on there, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Bangkok and talk with J.S. Kim of smartknowledgeu.com, where you find his blog about the state of the economy and precious metals. J.S. Kim, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max, and Happy New Year to you.
Oh, thanks so much. Yes, I was just surfing over to smartknowledgeu.com, and there are some fantastic stories on there and articles, and especially about education going forward in the next few years. I think a lot of people will find very interesting. Now, J.S. Kim, silver ended the 2010 up 83.5%. It's rocketed in the first few days already of 2011. What's going on? What do we see in 2011?
Well, I think in 2011, you'll see the progression of silver rise higher again. I think what we have going on, and also thanks to your campaign that went viral, so I want to congratulate you on the buy an ounce of silver and crash JP Morgan. I think you're going to have some of the silver price suppression schemes end in 2011, or at least have JP Morgan run for the exits because the shorts will be getting killed. So I think right now, even at 30, 31 an ounce, silver is still highly undervalued. I don't like to make predictions because they're so hard. It's so hard to predict where silver is going to go in the next 6 months, the next 12 months, next 2 years. But I do think it will head multiples higher of where it is right now.
All right, now let's move over to something you wrote recently. J.S. Kim explains why the Sampoon Superstore disaster provides a good analogy for the U.S. economy. Tell us more.
Okay, well, basically, in Seoul, there was a department store that structurally appeared to be very sound, but no one was aware of it at the time that it was structurally very, very weak. Because what had happened was during construction, the structural width columns had been cut 25%. The load had been increased about 4 times the original blueprint. And even though you had, city officials that had to approve the blueprints, they were bribed. And so, they took money basically to look the other way to build, this crappy department building from a fundamental, from a structural standpoint, and eventually collapsed, killing a lot of people. So I think, what we have with the pretty significant rise in U.S. stock markets for the last 4 months or the last quarter of 2010, it's, the same thing. Structurally, there's nothing to support that. I mean, the retail investor has fled. We had, I believe now, 33 consecutive weeks of outflows from mutual funds. If not for the U.S. Fed Reserve POMO operations, I think, the stock market would be crashing now. So on the surface, everything looks okay. And just like the Sampoong department store disaster, we have, the regulators that are basically, taking bribes to look the other way.
Okay, so structurally, the U.S. economy is weak. And you mentioned something in there, and I want to go back to it for a second, POMO, or Permanent Open Market Operations. So explain a little bit how this works.
POMO operations are basically designed to recapitalize U.S. banks. So what happens is the U.S. Fed Reserve, they just print money out of thin air, and they buy U.S. Treasury bonds, maturing U.S. Treasury bonds. Otherwise, the Treasury bond market would collapse as well. And therefore, the banks are recapitalized, they have money, and I assume they take a lot of that money and put it back into the stock market, because certainly the retail investor is not buying. So the retail investor has fled the market. There's been a lot of questions asked. Who is actually buying U.S. stocks to make the stock market go up?
Now, this is, of course, completely anathema to the idea of free market capitalism in America, which relies on something called price discovery, which means that you've got folks in the market, buyers and sellers, interested in making transactions in a way that's outside of central planning, command and control economics, and all the government interference that is associated with other styles of economics and governing, such as, quote, socialism or, quote, communism. So how does the American administration get away with being labeled as a communist dictatorship if they're in the market every day buying and selling securities at the expense of the citizens who are getting ripped off?
Yeah, I think exactly you described the mechanism, but that's, we have a lot of pundits or people that are looked upon as experts, say, such as Alan Greenspan, right, that in the past has blamed free markets for what is going on today. So we have a lot of misinformation, because certainly when central banks meddle so much with free markets and buy and sell securities, there are no free markets. So, I think that the people, the public, are really misled by, central bankers and by, CEOs and executives on Wall Street. So that's why I think there's a misunderstanding of exactly how the market operates today.
All right, let's talk about a genuine financial, political dictatorship, China. Albert Edwards, who is over there at Societe Generale, calls China, quote, a freak economy that will collapse soon. So, J.S. Kim, is this similar to what you're saying in the U.S. in terms of a structural instability, or is it slightly different? Walk us through how this might occur.
Sure. Well, I also think, there's certainly bubbles in China, certainly in the real estate stock market, but that's due to, basically every central bank, I think, is involved in a game of chicken, right? Because one central bank devalues their currency, their domestic currency, and the other central banks have to follow. Otherwise, their exports suffer. So nobody wants, basically to be the first to be fiscally responsible and do the right thing, because it's kind of like a domino effect. So everyone's following. So that's why I think there are massive bubbles everywhere, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the U.S., or whether it's in, the major markets in Asia.
Okay, let's expand on this game of chicken analogy that you're using. So otherwise known, you could call it game theory, or the prisoner's dilemma, or the Nash equilibrium, any number of ways. In other words, you've got two players and they're careening toward each other, China and the U.S. They're both looking to extract rent from each other. So assuming that these two collide, and they collide pretty quickly, possibly this year, who is going to be the winner at the end of the day?
I think it depends upon what the true gold reserves are, right? And I think with China, they certainly are cognizant, I think, of what's going on. And I don't think you ever get the truth from a central banker. So, I mean, certain times, China's official spokespeople said they'll continue to support, the U.S. dollar, which I don't think they're doing. I think instead they're going and buying commodities. You can see that certainly in their gold reserves. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they certainly have made a conscious effort to increase their gold reserves. I think in their sovereign wealth funds, which aren't public, they've also bought a lot of commodities and a lot of hard assets. And I think that's the way they're attempting to protect themselves. Now, on the flip side with the U.S., since we haven't had an audit of our official gold reserves since, I don't know what administration it was, but it was, many, many decades ago, no one really knows if the U.S.'s official gold reserves are actually correct. So I think at the end of the day, it depends on, who has the most precious metals and hard assets as far as who will survive, the fiat currency game of chicken that we're seeing.
Okay, well, in those terms, clearly the U.S. has an advantage. If the gold that they say that they have in Fort Knox is actually there, approximately 8,000 tons, versus China's supply of, I believe it's somewhere in the area of 3,000 tons. They have said that they want to increase that level by 4,000 or 5,000 tons. But I want to ask you something. You're over there at smartknowledgeu.com. So let me ask you a question, a bit theoretical. What if China decides to play this game of chicken by announcing that they're going to monetize their gold supply and be the first country in the world to monetize their gold supply? What effect would this have? The fact that they have less gold to monetize would actually work in their favor because it would therefore equal a concurrent devaluation of their currency, if you know what I'm driving at. Have you given this any thought, J.S. Kim?
Yeah, I think the first country to do that will win because everyone will want to own their currency. And everyone will get rid of all the other fiat currencies that are basically backed by nothing or the full faith and credit of governments, which is basically nothing, right? So I think the first country that can actually, accomplish that goal will certainly, strengthen their domestic country and strengthen their economy greatly.
Right, and the fact that they actually have less gold in the U.S. would work as a simultaneous devaluation of their currency, which would help their export market. So it's a double 1-2 punch if they were to monetize their gold. So now looking ahead to 2011, J.S. Kim, what are your predictions, some of the 2 or 3 trends you see going forward for the rest of the year now?
Well, the easy trends to call, I think gold and silver will continue to rise, but I think we will have, because of a deepening global monetary crisis, we'll have greater bouts of volatility, both to the upside and to the downside. But I don't think that, $100 moves in gold, not that would be common, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that. If gold moves up $100, silver moves up $2 or $3 a day, I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Perhaps towards the latter part of 2011, maybe not so much in the beginning, but I do think that we're going to move out of the eye of the hurricane, which is basically, we saw stock markets that were calm, even though we have unemployment rising in the United States and much of the Western world, even though inflation is, about, I think last time Ben Bernanke was on 60 Minutes a couple months ago, he said inflation in the U.S. was 1.18%. Well, we all know it's about 8% or higher. So, I think the trends are you're going to see more volatility even in stock markets, because I've always learned over the years that, as much as fraud can cause a short-term rise in the stock markets, that there's going to be some point in time that fraud does break down, that meddling in the free market. So it wouldn't even surprise me to see another flash crash, happen in 2011 again.
Right, and getting over to this inflation number that Bernanke's talking about, of course, the way to get to the quote-unquote real interest rates is to take the current discount rate, subtract the CPI number, the real CPI number, and you end up with the real interest rates going forward. And of course, that number currently is negative, which means everyone's losing purchasing power, which means, again, people are looking to revive their fortunes in the precious metals markets. Is that what you see as well?
Yeah, I think that's totally accurate, because I can't understand still how anyone in the U.S., and believe me, because I still talk to a lot of people in America that they believe that there's actually economic recovery happening. They believe all the propaganda, because certainly I think if these people were introspective enough to take a look at their quality of life, I think that they would see that their quality of life and their lifestyle is decreasing, just because of what you said. Because certainly the increase that is certainly for corporate America, the increase in income, annual income, basically the cost of living adjustment they get certainly does not equate with the devaluation of the dollar. Certainly have much more inflation. We have more taxes now. So I think that Americans all across the board, except maybe the richest top 1% of America, has lost a great deal in the quality of life.
All right, J.S. Kim, thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Okay, thanks a lot, Max. It was my pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, J.S. Kim of smartknowledgeu.com. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.